What you're about to witness is not just another case in Judge Frank Caprio's courtroom. It's one of those moments when time seems to stop, when justice, compassion, and the fragile beauty of human love collide so powerfully that even the most stoic hearts in the room break open. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon in late October. Providence Municipal Court was following its usual rhythm. The soft hum of voices, the scrape of chairs, the low murmur of lawyers discussing cases in the back rows. Outside, the autumn sun filtered through the windows in golden stripes, painting the wood panels with a warm, nostalgic glow. It was the kind of light that makes everything feel more precious. The kind of light that reminds people that life, like fall itself, is fleeting. Judge Frank Caprio had presided over countless hearings in that same courtroom for more than 3 decades. He knew every pattern, every rhythm of the proceedings. The excuses, the apologies, the laughter, the tension, the human drama. But nothing, not even his years of experience, could have prepared him for the case that was about to unfold. At precisely 20:45 p.m., the double doors at the back of the courtroom opened slowly. The sound was soft, almost reverent. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, and several heads turned instinctively. Through those doors stepped a woman who seemed to carry the weight of nearly a century on her shoulders, and yet something about her presence commanded respect. Her name was Margaret Maggie Eleanor O'Connor, and she was 92 years old. She moved carefully, each step measured and deliberate, supported by a silver walker decorated with faded photographs taped along the handles. Black and white wedding pictures, a smiling man in military uniform, family snapshots that told the story of a long, full life. Her hair was white and neatly curled, her floral dress pressed with the care of someone who still believed that appearances mattered, even at her age. On her left wrist was a thin gold bracelet worn from decades of use, and pinned near her collar was a tiny pearl brooch that caught the afternoon light with quiet dignity. There was a hush as she approached the defendant's stand. Even before she spoke, her frailty and grace drew an unspoken respect from everyone present. The court clerk, who usually read names briskly from the docket, softened his voice instinctively. "Mrs. Margaret O'Connor," he called. Maggie raised her head, her eyes bright but wary. "Yes, Your Honor," she said, her voice trembling slightly but clear. "That's me. Margaret Eleanor O'Connor." The courtroom fell silent again. Judge Caprio looked up from his paperwork, taking in the sight of this elderly woman who had made the effort to appear in person for a parking ticket that could have been easily mailed in or handled by a relative. He could immediately tell there was more to this than a routine violation. "Mrs. O'Connor," he began gently, "you're charged with parking in a hospital loading zone for 3 hours. The fine is $45. Before we begin, are you comfortable? Would you like a chair? We can bring one for you." Maggie shook her head slowly. Her hands gripped the walker, knuckles pale but steady. "No, thank you, Your Honor. I'll stand. I came here to tell you something, and I want to do it properly. Standing, like we used to when we spoke to people in authority." Her words, simple, firm, and polite, carried the quiet strength of another generation. Judge Caprio nodded, sensing the importance of what was about to be said. He set his papers aside and leaned forward slightly. "All right, Mrs. O'Connor," he said softly. "Please tell me what happened. Why were you parked in the loading zone that day?" The old woman took a slow breath. Her fingers tightened on the walker, and for a long moment, she seemed to be gathering the courage to speak. Then she lifted her head, and her words filled the courtroom with a fragile kind of truth that no one could prepare for. "Your Honor," she began, her voice trembling but clear, "I parked there because my husband, Thomas, is in the hospital. We've been married 71 years. He's dying." The sentence hung in the air, heavy and heartbreaking. The courtroom, once filled with the rustle of papers and murmurs, became utterly still. Even the faint tapping of the stenographer's keys stopped mid-stroke. Maggie continued, her voice growing softer with each word. "Thomas was diagnosed with end-stage heart failure 6 months ago. The doctors said it could be weeks. He's been so strong all his life, but now," she paused, her lips trembling, "now he's fading. I go to the hospital every day. I sit by his bed and hold his hand and talk to him. I tell him about the weather, about the kids, about anything that will make him smile." Her eyes filled with tears, but she kept speaking. "I'm 92, Your Honor. I can't walk very far anymore. The hospital parking lot is far from the cardiac ward, and the walk leaves me exhausted. By the time I get to his room, I've lost 15, maybe 20 minutes. And those minutes matter now. Every minute does." She stopped and pressed a trembling hand to her chest. "So that day, I parked in the loading zone. It was close. It gave me 15 more minutes with him. 15 more minutes to hold his hand, to tell him I love him, to sit with him while he still remembers who I am." Judge Caprio swallowed hard. His eyes, usually calm and steady, began to glisten. "Maggie," he said softly, "does your husband know you're here today?" She shook her head. "No, Your Honor. I didn't tell him. He worries enough already. Even now, he asks if I'm eating well, if I'm sleeping, if I got home safe from the hospital. I couldn't tell him that I got in trouble over a parking ticket. He's always been my protector. I didn't want him to think he failed me in his last days." Her voice wavered, and she took a shaky breath before continuing. "I could have just paid the $45, she said. "But I was afraid. Afraid that if I did, they'd keep giving me tickets or maybe tow my car. I was scared they'd tell me I couldn't come back. So I came here to explain. To ask you if there's any way I can park there. Just until." Her voice broke. "Just until Thomas doesn't need me there anymore." There wasn't a dry eye left in the courtroom. The young clerk lowered his gaze, blinking rapidly. Even the bailiff, a stoic man of few words, bit his lip to keep his composure. Judge Caprio sat silently for several seconds, absorbing every word. Then, in a rare moment that none of his staff would ever forget, he pushed his chair back and stood up from the bench. "Court will take a 15-minute recess," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "Everyone please remain seated. Mrs. O'Connor, don't move. I'll be right back." The judge disappeared through a side door into his chambers. The courtroom stayed silent. Maggie stood quietly at her walker, unsure what was happening, her eyes fixed on the wooden floor. The people seated behind her exchanged soft glances but said nothing. Minutes passed, 5, 10, then 15. When the door finally opened again, Judge Caprio returned, his expression a mixture of sadness and resolve. He sat down, straightened his papers, and then looked directly at Maggie. "Mrs. O'Connor," he said, "I just spoke with the administrator of Rhode Island Hospital. I explained your situation, and I have some news for you." And Maggie's hands tightened around her walker. "They're going to issue you a special parking pass," the judge said. "You'll be able to park as close as possible to the cardiac unit for as long as your husband is there. No fines, no tickets, no restrictions. And a hospital volunteer will meet you every day to escort you directly to his room." Though for a second, Maggie just stood there frozen. Then she covered her face with her hands as tears streamed down her cheeks. Judge Caprio wasn't finished. "Your parking ticket, Mrs. O'Connor, is dismissed completely. But that's not all. From today forward, this court will establish a new policy, in your and Thomas's name. Any elderly person visiting a dying spouse in a hospital who receives a parking citation will have it dismissed automatically and will be given the same compassionate parking arrangement." Gasps filled the courtroom, followed by a long silence and then unexpectedly applause. Not the kind of applause born from formality or performance, but the genuine, heartfelt clapping of people witnessing something profoundly human. Maggie could barely find her words. "Your Honor," she whispered, her voice shaking, "you would do that for me." Judge Caprio walked around the bench, and came down to where she stood. He gently took her hand in both of his. "For you," he said. For every couple who knows what it means to love someone for a lifetime." The courtroom, filled with strangers from every walk of life. Young defendants, lawyers, police officers, visitors, all sat motionless, some weeping silently. It wasn't just about the ticket anymore. It was about something far greater. Judge Caprio smiled softly through the tears that glimmered in his eyes. "Mrs. O'Connor," he said, 71 years of marriage. That's something rare and sacred. How did you do it? How did you and your husband make love last that long?" Maggie looked up at him, her face wet but glowing with quiet joy. "We never went to bed angry," she said simply. "Not once. We always said I love you before closing our eyes. We held hands everywhere. Walking to church, at the movies, even grocery shopping. We laughed together when we were broke. We forgave each other when we were stubborn, and we chose each other every single morning. Even on the hard days. Especially on the hard days." Her words hung in the air like a benediction. Judge Caprio turned back toward the courtroom, visibly moved. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "this is what real love looks like. Mrs. O'Connor didn't break the law out of carelessness. She broke it because 15 minutes with the man she's loved for 71 years was worth more than any fine, any rule, or any regulation." The people in the room nodded, some sobbing quietly. The moment transcended law, transcended procedure. It was simply about the enduring force of love itself. And as Maggie stood there, her small frame shaking from tears and gratitude, she looked up at the judge once more and whispered, "Your Honor, I didn't mean to break the rules. I just wanted more time." Judge Caprio replied softly, "Mrs. O'Connor, sometimes the rules need to bend, for love like yours." When the gavel finally came down, there was no sharp crack of judgment, only the quiet echo of something far deeper, compassion. The bailiff, normally stern and unshakable, wiped his eyes discreetly. The court reporter set her pen down for a moment to steady her hands, and as the crowd began to file out, several people approached Maggie to offer hugs, handshakes, and words of love that came straight from their hearts. Outside, the autumn light had softened into a pale gold haze. The courthouse steps were framed by falling leaves that spiraled gently to the ground. Reporters were waiting there, alerted by a clerk who had called the local news after witnessing what had unfolded. As Maggie slowly emerged, holding her walker, the cameras clicked, but she didn't flinch. She didn't see herself as the story. She only wanted to get back to her husband. One of the young journalists asked softly, "Mrs. O'Connor, how does it feel knowing Judge Caprio dismissed your case and changed the policy because of you?" Maggie blinked, her eyes glistening. "I don't feel special," she said. "I just feel thankful. I wasn't trying to make a point. I was just trying to see my husband. But if what happened today helps someone else hold their loved one's hand a little longer, then I'm grateful." The video of the courtroom moment aired that night on local television. Within hours, it had gone viral across social media, millions of views, tens of thousands of shares, and comments from people all over the world who said they had been touched to tears. "That judge restored my faith in humanity. This is what love looks like. If my grandparents were still alive, I know they'd understand every word," she said. The clip spread far beyond Rhode Island, reaching as far as Europe, South America, and Asia. It became more than just a courtroom story. It became a message, a reminder that compassion has a place in the law, and that sometimes justice wears the face of mercy. At the hospital, the staff gathered around a television in the nurses' lounge as the footage played. When Maggie arrived later that afternoon, she was met by applause from nurses, orderlies, and even the hospital director himself. One of them, a young nurse named Clara, approached her gently. "Mrs. O'Connor," she said, smiling through tears, "I just saw what you did. You made all of us cry, in the best way, and I want you to know something. We all set up something for you." Maggie tilted her head curiously. Clara handed her a laminated badge, the hospital's new Compassion Visitor Pass. On it was Maggie's photo, taken moments earlier by the hospital's PR team, and beneath it bold letters that read, "In recognition of unconditional love, authorized for unrestricted access to Cardiac Ward 3B. Maggie smiled softly, clutching the badge as if it were a sacred relic. When she entered room 312, her husband Thomas was sitting upright in bed, thin but alert, his oxygen tubes resting against his pale cheeks. He looked up as she entered, his eyes lighting up instantly. "There's my girl," he whispered, smiling. "You're late today. Did traffic get you?" She laughed softly, shaking her head. "No, my love. Just court." He frowned slightly. "Court?" She walked to his bedside, pulled up a chair, and took his hand. "It's all taken care of," she said. "You just rest." He gave her a long, searching look. "Maggie, what did you do?" She smiled, brushing a loose strand of his white hair away. "Nothing, dear. I just explained to a kind man that sometimes love is more important than a parking sign." For the next several days, things changed around the hospital. People recognized her wherever she went, nurses smiled, visitors stopped to thank her, and even security guards offered her warm greetings. But Maggie didn't care about the attention. All that mattered was the time she had left with Thomas. She read to him from his favorite book, The Old Man and the Sea, and hummed old Irish lullabies while he dozed. Sometimes they sat in silence, their hands entwined, letting the quiet say everything words no longer could. Then one night, just as the winter cold began to settle over the city, Thomas took her hand and whispered, "Maggie, do you remember the first dance we ever had?" Her eyes filled with tears. "Of course I do. You stepped on my toes 3 times and I fell in love with you anyway." He smiled weakly. "I'd step on them 1,000 more times just to have one more dance with you." She squeezed his hand. "When you get better, we'll dance again." But he didn't answer. The monitors around the bed beeped softly, then slowed. Maggie leaned forward, resting her forehead against his. "I love you," she whispered. Always, and just like that, after 71 years together, Thomas O'Connor took his last breath, with his wife's hands wrapped around his, and her voice being the last sound he ever heard. The hospital staff wept with her that night. Word spread quickly, and even Judge Caprio sent flowers with a handwritten note that read, "To Margaret O'Connor, thank you for reminding us that the law serves people, not the other way around. You and Thomas have taught us more about love than any book of rules ever could." Maggie attended the small funeral wearing the same pearl brooch she'd worn to court. Dozens of strangers came, nurses, reporters, courthouse staff, even young people who'd seen the viral video and wanted to pay their respects. After the ceremony, she sat quietly at the graveside, her hands folded. "We did it, Tommy," she whispered. "We made it all the way." In the weeks that followed, something extraordinary happened. Inspired by her story, a local philanthropist reached out to Judge Caprio and proposed establishing a fund, a charity in honor of Maggie and Thomas. The judge agreed immediately. They called it the O'Connor Legacy Fund, a program providing free parking permits, transportation, and meal support for elderly caregivers visiting terminally ill loved ones in hospitals across Rhode Island. Within months, the fund expanded statewide. Within a year, it reached hospitals in Massachusetts, Connecticut, and beyond. Maggie was invited to speak at the first dedication ceremony. When she arrived, now using a wheelchair, she looked around at the crowd, doctors, nurses, families, volunteers, and community members, and smiled faintly. "I'm not a public speaker," she began softly, her voice trembling. "But I know something about love. Love is what makes all of this matter. When you're young, You think love is about fireworks, excitement, and grand gestures. But when you've been married 71 years, you learn that love is quieter. It's making tea when the other can't get out of bed. It's holding a hand in silence when words have run out. It's parking a little too close to a hospital door because you can't bear to waste one more minute away. She paused, her eyes glistening. If this little fund helps someone have that extra minute, that one more moment, then Tommy's still with me. And that's enough. The audience rose to their feet, applauding through tears. The moment was recorded, just like her courtroom appearance, and that too went viral. This time, people didn't just cry, they acted. Donations poured in from around the world, enough to expand the program to dozens of hospitals across the U.S. Even national figures praised the initiative. In a televised interview, Judge Caprio was asked how one elderly woman could inspire such a movement. He smiled gently and said, "Because she reminded us of something we forgot. That compassion is not weakness. It's the purest form of justice." By the following year, Maggie's health had begun to decline. She spent her last months surrounded by letters, hundreds of them, from people she'd never met, wives who had lost husbands, husbands who had said goodbye to their wives, children who thanked her for teaching them the meaning of love. One letter, written by a nurse from Chicago, read, "Because of you, my father got to see my mother every day until she passed. You gave us time we wouldn't have had. Thank you, Mrs. O'Connor." On her 93rd birthday, Maggie sat by her window, a cup of tea in her hand and the sunlight warm on her face. Her nurse entered quietly to check on her, but she was smiling, a faint, peaceful smile. Her hand rested on a photo of her and Thomas, taken on their wedding day. She was gone. Her funeral drew hundreds. Judge Caprio spoke again, standing by the same pearl brooch pinned to her dress. "She came to this court for mercy," he said. "And she left this world having changed the meaning of it." In the years that followed, the O'Connor Legacy Fund continued to grow. Universities began teaching her case as an example of compassionate jurisprudence. Law students studied it not as a legal precedent, but as a human one, a reminder that the soul of the law must never be lost in its letters. A small plaque was later placed in the Providence Municipal Court, beneath the American flag. It reads, "In memory of Margaret and Thomas O'Connor, whose love reminded us that justice without compassion is empty, and that sometimes 15 minutes can mean a lifetime." Every morning before court begins, Judge Caprio glances at that plaque. Sometimes he smiles quietly. Sometimes he whispers, "Thank you, Maggie." And somewhere, in a way words can't capture, maybe she hears him. Because love, as she once said, doesn't end when the body fades. It lingers in the spaces we leave behind, in the laws we soften, the hearts we open, and the hands we still reach for, even when they're gone.